Welcome to the masses, and congratulations if you've happened to stumble upon this channel because you're in luck. And if you've come to this channel on your own will, congratulations on your wisdom. Because this is Young Justice, a show concerned with education and child well-being, and as promised, every week and every month I come on with a guest who is some sort of an expert in the field. Today, I won't waste time. This is Mark Stein, Master of Education, performer, teacher, a colleague, pretty all-around good guy. What I want to talk about today is how this man will demystify the topics that we are all disgusted by.
Or remystify.
Okay. Before we get into our huge arguments, let me just... No, exactly. Make these topics as mystifying as they ought to be. But before I even get into that, and I'm talking about math and science and politics, the things that we cringe when we hear.
Yeah.
First, let's do a little intro.
Right.
I mean, who are you?
I guess my biggest part of my self-definition is I'm a teacher for children. I have been teaching in elementary schools for, I don't know, on and off for 25 years. I've been teaching at an elementary school here in Vermont. I'm going into my 7th year. I'm also an artist and performing artist. I also teach performing arts. Those are all things that are really close to my heart.
Topics that you seem to thrive in are these topics I just mentioned, 2 of them being math and science.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, these are your specialties. And
you know, they're kind of my specialties by default.
Yeah.
I'm a science enthusiast, and you know, it seems like a lot of people don't have a very high comfort level with science. I'm very comfortable talking about science and teaching science. Mathematics was an interesting route, getting sort of slotted into that role of a math teacher. You know, I was a poor math student as a kid.
Ah, that's not something you chose all the way through?
No, I was one of these classically traumatized math students. And I kind of figured things out in high school, and I did well enough in high school, and by the end of high school, you know, I did well enough on my entrance exams at college that I sort of placed out of mathematics. But then when I started getting into teaching, I realized that I didn't really understand mathematics on a foundational level. And that's when my real interest in math and teaching mathematics developed.
Something weird happens in your classroom, Mark. I work with Mark at the school, and unfortunately no longer. We've just departed. But your kids come out of your class talking about math and science, and I can't get them to go to these things like recess and lunch.
Right.
Why? What's going on? What's wrong with your class?
You know, just about everything. You know, I think that it happens because of I start from a place of building classroom culture. I really don't start with any topic at all. I start with, and you know, the things I'm about to say, I'm hesitant to say because they have become buzzwords and have become meaningless and have become buzz phrases. And I kind of recoil at even speaking these words, but I have an authentically inquiry-based environment in my classroom, and one that authentically rewards inquiry. You know, this is kind of one of these things that is widely talked about, often imitated, but never or seldom practiced in an authentic way.
Exactly. That's why I wanted to have you on. The very fact that these are buzzwords and that they're not being applied in the way that the words are being used.
Right.
That's what I want to talk to you about. And
you know, I don't want to interrupt you, but I want to, because it's tricky business, I want to enter into this conversation with a basic understanding that I believe that the vast majority of teachers are very well-meaning and are really talented, creative people, but are often people who are, during a formative stage in their careers, placed in a completely untenable condition.
Right.
And have to balance countervailing mandates. And the difficulty is between these 2 countervailing mandates, being authentically inquiry-driven genuinely responding to your students' intellectual needs on the one hand, and having a certain amount of, and I'm not going to describe it as content that has to be covered, but having a certain amount of evidence of content, manufacturing product on the other hand, that countervailing need, one of those things is very public. And the other one of those things, the results are predominantly intangible, unless there's someone like you around who notices, hey, Stein's kids won't shut up about math.
Yeah, you can quantify it if you choose to. You can quantify what is coming out of the classroom, how much learning is being done, if you choose to do it. I mean, there are ways to, anytime that you see a behavior, anytime you see kids as a huge happy group and you know that they're learning, you could put that on some sort of format.
But that's really just a qualifier to say, what I'm not saying here is, hey, I do something that's available to everyone. I'm fortunate to teach in an environment where I'm able to do that.
Right. Well, so people that are listening, at least the people I know who are listening are all sorts of people, actually, parents, people who teach at public schools, people who teach at private schools. But for people who don't even know what we're talking about, these buzzwords and talking about question-driven learning, can you tell me what you mean?
I can tell you what is often meant and what I mean.
Okay.
Those are two different things. Mm-hmm. It feels to me like education in schools follows a long series of crises, and every generation of teachers, principals in schools has its own crisis. No one's learning math. No one knows how to write. Teachers aren't teaching curriculum, whatever. And so I think that one of the current crisis is we are not graduating students who are thinkers. We're not graduating students who are excited about being lifelong learners. And so in order to correct for that, we need to make what's happening in the classroom relevant to students. And that sounds great, and the solutions to that, from my perspective as a consumer or former consumer of educational materials, because I use very little prepackaged curriculum now, the solutions are kind of laughable. And instead of a math problem about math, it's going to be a math problem about a bunch of kids who want to sell lemonade.
Right, and that's supposed to make it real.
Right. Oh, kids like baseball. Let's make this about batting averages. And, I've sat with kids. I've worked as a tutor. I've sat with kids and looked at these problems. They categorically fail to get excited about the math problem just because it's about batting averages.
Well, it's like all it does is make baseball less interesting.
Right, exactly. So that's not what I mean about inquiry-driven education. You'll notice there's almost no inquiry involved in that.
Right.
And when inquiry does enter into the classroom, it often consists of, and I say this a lot, it often consists of a teacher saying, here's a topic, now your job is to tell me why you find it interesting. Mm-hmm. And again, that is, this sort of pantomime of inquiry. But inquiry only is one thing. Inquiry only is the asking of a relevant question, a question that's relevant to the asker.
Let me just parse that for a second. So when you're giving a topic and then saying, all right, tell me what you think is interesting about this, what that really is doing is setting this narrow confine of conversation.
Yeah.
So that's actually not driven then by questions. What it is driven by some sort of instruction that now you're trying to force questions to come out of learning.
Yeah, and it's what, I'm also a magician, and it's what I refer to as magician's choice, which is a very sneaky way of guiding someone towards what you want. So if I say to the class, okay, we're going to be studying spiders, what's interesting about spiders, I generally as a teacher, have a curriculum like locked and loaded and ready to go. Like it's in the barrel, I just want to pull the trigger now. And so I'm sitting here poised waiting for the right question to come along. And questions that are tangential to that curriculum, I'm going to say, well, we're not really talking about that right now. Well, now I've just shot my inquiry in the foot. That's not inquiry.
Okay, so open it up now. What does it really look like?
It looks like what inquiry looks like absolutely anywhere else in the world. Someone spontaneously coming up with a question because they've seen something or heard something or experienced something that has made them curious. And unless you're wide open and ready for this to happen, inquiry isn't going to exist in your classroom. It's time consuming and it's nerve wracking. I'm thinking about I tend to tell people I run my classroom like a startup, like a really energetic kind of funky startup. When Google started, they were famous for having lots and lots of people who were just asking questions non-productively, and not wondering always, how are we going to monetize this? With the understanding that if something sufficiently interesting comes up, the product will appear. So I start my day with a conversation with my students. And I have no idea what that conversation is going to be about most of the time. Sometimes I'll sit down and I'll say, I thought about something the other day and here's what I experienced. What do you think about it? But just as often a student will sit down and we just start chatting. It's nerve-wracking for a teacher, especially a younger, more inexperienced teacher, to do that. It feels like wasted time because no product is being produced. But some of the most fruitful and important conversations in my classroom, which lead to actual standards-based learning, grew out of those conversations. You and I have talked a little bit privately about how I have this odd structure in my classroom where I have this kind of parliamentary democracy. And I come clean with my students. I say, this is a very limited parliamentary democracy, and ultimately I control everything, sort of, but actually not really, because if you decided to be completely intractable, what could I possibly do? So I have this system where students are able to raise motions and second motions and vote on motions. And it actually guides the course of the classroom during the day.
The environment of having a voice and a choice?
That's a big part of it, certainly. That's a really big part of it. It's many things at once. Yes, it is the environment of having a voice and a choice, and that's very empowering, obviously, for a student. It's also an opportunity to learn boundaries. In any social system, or political system which is embedded in a social system, you're not going to be able to operate successfully unless you understand the boundaries. And so a student who raises her hand and says, I raise a motion that we cancel this math lesson and go to gym instead. Well, that student is, that motion will be immediately seconded. And so the way my system works is I have veto power over any motion. Any veto can be overturned by a unanimous vote. And there have been moments in my classroom where a student has said, I raise a motion that we cancel this and go to the gym. And I'll turn to that student and I'll say, listen, this is not a good idea. You might win this fight, but ultimately, I really do need this math lesson to happen, and so do you, and you're going to undermine your own ability to operate within this system. Well, that's a boundary, and it's a boundary that's described and explained pretty reasonably to that student, and I have to tell you, in many years of using this system, I have almost never come to loggerheads with students about some point of parliamentary procedure or a decision that we have to make. And the one time that I can think of, there were maybe 3 times where a veto was overturned. And one of those times was, I consider to be my most important teaching day.
And for you, a veto has to be overturned by a unanimous
vote.
Okay.
Yeah. And I remember one time in the classroom, we actually, it was one of those times, it was a very funny moment where a student raised a motion to like totally scuttle what I was doing, you know, and got the votes. And I looked around the room and I vetoed, and they overturned the veto. And it was a really bad moment for that to happen. I really needed it not to be the case. And so I looked around and I said to my students, well, guess what? I have more power in this building than you do. And so if you push through this veto, I am going to abolish the democracy and take over this classroom as a dictatorship. And they said, you can't do that. And I said, actually, I can. Let's talk about times and places around the world where similar things have happened. And many of these kids, for the first time, had an experience of, I'm not going to say understanding how government works, because that's a big, you know, I mean, that's a lifelong process. It was these students' very first glimpse under the hood that they've heard of voting, they've heard of democracy, you know, they've heard of kings and queens and dictators and rulers and unfair, the whole thing. They never really thought about how it happens or what it is. And ultimately, those kids did succeed partially in their goal. The lesson that I had planned for that morning did not
Totally
occur.
abolished.
Didn't happen. We didn't wind up going to the gym, but we wound up talking for an hour about how governments can transition from parliamentary, you know, democracy or from a type of government which they would, you know, describe as more fair, to a type of government where people had less decision-making power, and how decision-making power drives. So, you know, a conversation like that, the average novice teacher will just, through no fault of her or his own, go into a horrible panic about, like, I was going to do improper fractions today. When's that going to happen?
But what I know about you is you come out of those situations, but you don't have your head down, and certainly neither do any of your students. You know, they just got to do exactly what you said. They raised a motion to try to defeat this lesson you intended to do, and maybe that lesson was extremely important to you, but that is not the only thing that matters. You had no idea you were going to teach about politics,
right,
or the way that government happens that day, but that's what happened. It became fulfilling. It became something everyone was interested in. And
we explored together based on inquiry.
But you didn't have to try to comb through or try to pick out what everybody's interest was. You just set up some sort of an environment where questions happen.
Right.
Where even when controversy happens, you can celebrate it.
Yeah.
So if a mistake or something that is you know, unexpected or some sort of doubt, you just lean on that and let that be your curriculum rather than shutting down and pushing it away.
Yeah. And I think that touches on the central fallacy. I would almost go out on a limb and describe this as the central fallacy dominating the teaching profession today, which is that in order to make a topic interesting for kids, it has to have some sort of relevance to their life in terms of referencing something that they've experienced or are interested in or know about. I think that we've lost faith as a teaching community in the inherent curiosity of children, in their built-in desire to acquire knowledge and understanding, and their built-in desire to have conversations.
Yeah, think about what's most interesting. Almost anyone you talk to, you have a long enough conversation about the most interesting things ever, and most of those things are only the unknown or something existential. So I'm not saying those are the only interesting things or the only ways to have conversations, but certainly supports your point that trying to figure out what people are already interested in and teaching them more about what they're already interested in,
Right.
that's a way. But that's, like you said, it's sort of a fallacy that must be what you do. If you can do that, then you're doing it perfectly.
Right.
And that's what I think the narrative sort of is now. And you'll notice that a lot of people have asked me to do something like this just because they're noticing it doesn't work.
Yeah. So you know what? Before the show we were talking about something. If I could, let me just sort of like sketch the outlines of a time, it was I think 2 years ago, where I actually got to watch in a very contained way this process come to fruition and actually circle back to something that, you know, is very identifiably standards-based education.
Okay.
Okay. We were studying this, we were doing a read aloud. I always have one book that, as our literature study, I'm reading aloud and we're discussing as a class. Mm-hmm. I very strongly believe that kids should not be limited to, thematic or, literary conversations about good books by their reading level. That seems absurd to me because reading is for many people a mechanical process that they may or may not be able to master. But understanding literature is a very separate thing. Mm. So we were reading this Salman Rushdie books, Haroun and the Sea of Stories, and there's this part where this water genie says something about, when you name something, you make it real. You've named that, and now it's real. Naming things makes it real. Well, that was one line I was maybe 5 minutes into my read aloud, and I stopped and I said to my students, this is an idea that's really interesting to me. And nobody was interested in this idea. But I said, it's interesting to me because, for example, a lot of, witchcraft and magic is based on that idea that when I name something, I make it real. I'm Jewish, and in my tradition in the Bible, there's this. So we had this conversation. It was a decent conversation. It was pretty good. It was good conversation. Not my greatest, but it was okay. So time passes. And meanwhile, it was wintertime on the playground. There was this enormous mound of snow that had been built. And students started tunneling. And other students started carrying away the tunneled out snow, which had this sort of crumbly quality that could be used that had use in other parts of the building process. And then the two groups, the tunnelers and the carrying away group, named themselves. The tunnelers were called Tunnel Town. The people carrying away the refuse were called Trash Co. And it was really interesting and cool. And of course, it deteriorated into a horrible situation. It was interesting from a sociological perspective, because what happened was the tunnels were finished, Trash Co. didn't have anything to do, and so we had this very kind of energetic but unemployed workforce that became very destructive and disruptive to Tunnel Town.
Anarchy.
And Tunnel Town didn't have enough room in their tunnels for the workers that had helped them build it. So aside from being this
it was Greece.
Yeah, it was this right. It was this aside from being this funky little microcosm of an economic system, but that was we had a couple little conversations about that, but it wasn't whatever. But all of this had happened weeks prior to the conversation about Haroun and the Sea of Stories. So we had this okay conversation about naming things and it being real, and then the conversation stops and I assume it's over. And the student says, that's what happened with Tunnel Town. And I'm like, what are you talking about, buddy? He said, well, and this was a kid who, if you were to only examine his affect, especially from kind of a self-conscious bias perspective, you'd say, uninvolved kid, not interested, pulling teeth to get this kid interested. But a bright, wonderful boy. And he said, that's what happened. Everything was going great. And then as soon as we started giving things names, everything fell apart. And a lot of kids have been very emotional about what had happened there. And a student said, I think we need to talk about this. And my response was, we definitely do, but we have an entire day's worth of classwork to get to, so we'll talk about it later. And a student said, I raise a motion that we talk about it right now. Seconded. And just experimentally, I vetoed the motion. And sure enough, it was overturned.
Everybody wanted to talk about Tunnel Town.
Everyone wanted to talk about it, but the conversation focused not just on the specific events that had happened. And that's not a very productive conversation because everyone has a different perspective of what happened, on that mound of snow. Everyone has their own idea, and there's no way to come together around that idea. Except that there is, because this one student made a text-to-self comparison, which is one of the things that you're going to see on rubrics old and new about, benchmarks for kids interacting with literature. Child makes text-to-self. Well, this was a very complex text-to-self where self is a representative of a group comparison. It's the highest possible level conversation to have in this classroom. And they actually used a concept embedded in the text that they were reading to illuminate their situation and went on to make decisions about other aspects of their play on the playground. Oh, this is Tunnel Town again. We're coming up with teams. It's going to turn into a problem. Where an idea was exported from literature to the classroom and then out the door into the playground.
And that's what learning is. You met a benchmark through some unexpected source of learning. You're letting people just be on their own in the world, and they're using your concepts or things that you're just showing them to guide them through, and that's what learning is. That's not, and so there is this idea of the memorization of facts is bad. There's more to learning than that. Yeah, but you do have to memorize some things.
I love memorizing facts.
And then the other polarizing view is that memorization of facts carries you through.
Right.
Because then you want to remember things except that experiencing things really is what matters. Even if nobody remembers that book, even if nobody remembers Tunnel Town,
right,
you're going to go on with that knowledge of the way that the world works,
yeah,
and with the worldview that was guided by you. You didn't tell them to have some sort of a worldview, but you guided them to be able to make decisions.
Yeah, but I think the two salient features of this is, number one, it takes a hell of a lot of time and faith in yourself as a teacher and faith in your students as people who wish to learn. Okay, so it does take an awful lot of time. And, but the other thing is, I'm comfortable with the fact that I do different things at different times. Mm-hmm. Being a teacher isn't one thing. And I will sit my students down in front of the board and say, here are some either facts or procedures that I'd like you to memorize.
Well, so we're being told we have not much time, but I really want, and this is selfish because this is a story that struck me really well. When we were talking just before this, you told me a story about, and I want to get back to math and the sciences, but you told me a story about relating to you being a magician, showing a card trick.
Right.
Real quick, can you?
Okay, so inquiry doesn't always happen on its own. So one of the skills as a teacher that I've tried to hone over the years is, how can I inspire inquiry? And one of my classics is, and I did this more often when I was working as an independent tutor. I do it occasionally in the classroom. I do this especially with students whose self-concept as a mathematician is really poor. They think of themselves as people who don't know math, aren't interested in math, and cannot do math.
Right.
So I'm an amateur magician, so I'll bring out a deck of cards and I'll ask a kid, do you know what this is? Yeah, it's a deck of cards. So I'll do the classic magic trick. Pick a card, shuffle it back into the deck, then I have you cut the cards and you cut right to your card, right? I start out modeling the inquiry process. I say to them, and they usually lead with a question. The question is, how did you do that? Mm-hmm. Right? That's the classic. How'd you do that? Because it's a pretty good card trick. And I will ask a student, well, are you saying that it couldn't have just happened? That it's impossible, right? We couldn't have had you select a card freely, shuffle it back into the deck, and then, there's only 52 cards in the deck. You're saying it's impossible? Student says no. We're already now integrating very important math concepts that touch on probability and lead me in a million different directions, right? So now I can start refining my question, and I can say to that student, okay, so you're not saying it's impossible that it would happen. What's a word to describe it? Improbable, unlikely, probably not going to happen? Great. So how many times do you think we'd have to do this before it actually worked? Do you think we'd have to do it 1,000,000 times? Well, no, we wouldn't have to do it 1,000,000 times. Do you think we'd have to do it 10 times? Probably more than 10.
Now you're leading on this refining process.
So now we can narrow our parameters to somewhere like, what, 300-400 times, and we can be pretty sure that one of those times it's going to happen. And I'll point out to a student, okay, so you are right now doing math, and the mathematical concepts that you're using to really get a handle on this situation are pretty complicated ones. So here's a question. What do you think you know about me based on what you saw? Well, you're a magician. Aha. Look what you just did. You used mathematics to figure out something about me that I didn't tell you. So you're already using the mathematics that you think you don't understand. I'd like to show you some techniques that you could use so that you can pry even more thoroughly, deeply, powerfully into different situations. Not to understand batting averages of your favorite baseball team, or to help your lemonade stand make a bigger profit, but because language is the mathematics of the universe, and I want to teach you that language. But then there has to be this oscillating negotiation between my request for them to work hard at something and my deliverables based on what they've learned can do.
Right.
And that's a relationship. But that's the key. It's a relationship.
It's environment first, relationships first, interesting inquiries first, the rest follows.
It all comes. I made this bold statement outside before the show where I said, if you gave me a student, I could probably teach the average student, not an excellent student, but the average student an entire school year's worth of mathematics in around 5 weeks. And I know that sounds like arrogance or hubris or a snub to the average classroom teacher. But to me, what it means is time spent building relationships. Time spent especially building a culture that validates the asking of authentic questions, and time allocated to answering them pays off exponential dividends down the road when you're asking your students for the favor of their attention.
I'm modeling that right now because I was told a while ago that we need to end. Mark, man, there is so much that I want to talk to you about. I would like to go further with you, so we might have to do a part 2 soon.
I'd love it.
But if there's one thing taken from this is that, I think we're doing it right now. I had no real structure or idea about where this is going to go. It was just phenomenally interesting. It was great talking to you, and thanks for the work you do with kids. So let's do it again soon.
Absolutely.
All right,
Thanks,
man.
Zach. All right.
And join us next time. Matt Dunn will be on the program August 30th. Tune in.